Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 10. Hopefully, all of you had a great week 9, making some progress on your culture projects. Related to that, I have some updates that I wanted to share on the syllabus, how we're going to proceed for the last couple of weeks of the class. As I mentioned earlier, I am removing the critical assessment outline that was due for week 10. And in its place, I'm going to have you submit a draft of your paper. I have a deadline of July 24th on here. That's Thursday, by the end of the day, Thursday. And my commitment to you is that I would be able to get you some feedback no later than July 31st. So give me about a week to get back to all of you. I'll try to do that sooner rather than later, but that'll at least give you another week or so to take that feedback. You also obviously can continue to work on your papers during that time. The other option I was going to offer up is that if you wanted to drop your paper into a Moodle discussion forum and ask for feedback, I've set that up for week 10 as well. And what I would ask is that if you are asking for feedback, that you provide feedback to at least one other classmate. And we'll see how that goes. There's not a lot of structure there, but hopefully all of you who are interested in getting some more eyes on your paper will be able to do that. The other change that I wanted to mention was for week 11. There were a couple of readings on the schedule for that week, one on organizational goals and effectiveness, and one on managing organizational change and development. I decided not to have you require you to do those readings because we don't have any sort of assessment or discussion following up on that. So certainly you're welcome to read that. I would encourage reading it, especially the second chapter on organizational change. That's really sort of been the theme of this whole class. So take a look at that on your own, but it's not there is no assignment associated with that reading. So I've removed that from the syllabus. I have put up a new syllabus in Moodle, and you'll see the changes indicated in there. And then finally, we'll be doing Zoom presentations during the last week of the class. And so what I plan to do is send out a doodle poll to all of you here fairly soon, and I'll have you give me a number of times, hopefully that will work. And my hope is that I can group all of you into maybe groups of 4 to 6 and meet everyone's time requirements. So I expect that here fairly soon, and we'll get the final week scheduled. So what I wanted to do today, let's talk about the readings a little bit. There's one Rainey chapter that's on teamwork. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this lecture talking about teams, managing, leading teams, communication in teams, and those sorts of things. But I think this is a really interesting chapter. And as far as sort of the organizational behavior side of it goes, I think a really important skill to have as an organizational leader and a manager is to be able to work effectively formulating and managing teams. The other reading we have this week is our final theory paper. This is from Joan Acker on gendering organization theory. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in this lecture talking about it, but I would encourage you in working in your culture projects to pay attention to what's going on in your organizations in terms of, are there sort of inherent biases, advantages or disadvantages based on gender that you see in your organizations? And if so, is the organization aware of those? Are they making concerted efforts to make changes for the better? Are they making progress on that? So it's an interesting paper, and again, something that I think might help you as you think through the final stages of your culture projects. What I wanted to do mostly today is talk a little bit about, like I said, teams, structure of teams. I think Rainey talks about the fact that teams, groups, committees, those sorts of smaller organizational structures really are how most work gets done in organizations. One of the things I thought I would share, I've really been interested in over the last few years, is how our organizations can become more adaptive, more innovative. So I thought I would share a couple of structural ideas that you might be interested in and provide some additional resources to look at. One of the ideas is from John Kotter, and I encourage you to take a look at this article from Harvard Business Review entitled Accelerate. The link is here. But one of the things that Kotter talks about in terms of making bureaucratic, hierarchically oriented organizations more adaptive is this metaphor of a dual operating system. And so one operating is this hierarchy that's embedded and probably not going to go away, especially in larger government organizations. But one of his solutions to making organization more adaptive is this concept is that you take people from the various sectors, silos of the organization, as well as various structural levels of the organization, and you build more or less what he calls a network of teams. And so in the middle there you see that he has this guiding coalition. The guiding coalition is critical in terms of coordinating, communicating, being sort of the glue that holds all of these other teams together. And then the outside teams really are, they can be, more permanent work groups, but task forces, short-term teams that are looking at processes, maybe doing some new initiative, new project that's going on, that type of thing. And so it's an interesting concept. Like I said, I encourage you to read a little bit more about it. Similarly, I think very much related is I've talked, I think, about this idea of team of teams from General Stanley McChrystal, who was the head of special forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he really did the same thing. He really found that the hierarchical chain of command was not conducive to conducting the kind of operations that were necessary in sort of modern warfare, where you're fighting against a network as opposed to a standing army. And so he really did make a concerted effort to move not just even from the traditional hierarchy, but even take a further step from, special forces typically are small teams. And he built this concept of the team of teams that, again, very much looks like, as you can see, Kotter's dual operating system, the network there. One of the things that McChrystal talks about is critical in having this work, obviously, is the communication part of it. There has to be this shared understanding, he called it a shared consciousness. And so he really focused deeply on making sure that everyone in the entire organization was clear about what the higher level objectives were, doing daily briefings and updates. And really, the idea was that he was empowering people on the ground to make decisions and to work within these teams to take actions without having to move decisions up and down the chain of command. But anyway, I encourage you. There's a book called Team of Teams by McChrystal and some co-authors. But if you Google Team of Teams, there are a lot of nice articles that sort of analyze his thinking and the outcomes of that. Rainey chapter talks a fair amount about sort of the communication patterns of communication within teams. And I thought I would share this just because I do think this is important. It's working in a large organization, the thing I hear every day is that we have poor communication. We have communication problems. And so part of your job as an organizational leader, obviously, is to sort of have an idea of how you're going to facilitate better communication within the organization, across the various teams that you might be managing. I happen to work for a person, actually the last couple of leaders that I've worked for, very much like this wheel concept, where they were in the center of it. They did a lot of one-on-ones with people, And the Rainey chapter talks about how this is actually probably the most efficient mechanism for communication and for decision making. But it also points out that it is one of the least satisfactory in terms of people within the organization knowing what's going on. The person in the middle, that person at the hub, maybe has a lot of satisfaction because they have a big picture of what's going on and they know what all the parts and pieces are doing. But as you can see in that wheel model, that the rest of the people in the organization are very much disconnected. The Rainey chapter talks a little bit about how there's much more satisfaction with this idea of the wheel, where people are all connected to other people within the organization. What it doesn't talk a lot about is this idea of the network. And as you look at this network, it looks very much like Kotter's, his dual operating system, his groupings of teams are very much like this image from McChrystal. I guess one of the things I would say about this is I worked on a project a few years ago where we assessed internal communication at the University of Montana. What we found was that most people in the organization believed that the way communication was supposed to work was actually this chain, and it was a hierarchical chain. And they all said that basically that was broken, that they did not get communication that they needed through that official chain of command, those official channels of communication. And what most of the people we talked to said was that what they had done is they had developed informal networks within the organization to find out the information they needed, to keep apprised on what others in the organization were doing. And so, the reality is with our technology today that every person certainly has the ability to be connected to anyone else in the organization through emails, chats, messaging, whatever that might be. And I think what I would really encourage you as a leader to think about is how you use that to your advantage, as opposed to trying to control communication. How do you unleash it? And part of it, I think there's a couple answers to that question of how you do that well. One is around culture. One is around making sure that people in the organization are guided by a shared vision, a set of principles, a purpose, those types of things, so that they're able to act independently, autonomously, and yet they're working in some sort of aligned fashion. The other thing that I want to talk a little bit about is I hear a lot of organizational leaders say, we have to communicate either through the chain of command or through this hub and spoke sort of model, because it's just not feasible. We don't have the time to have a whole bunch of people participating in decision making. And I guess I want to challenge that concept a little bit. I think that one of the things that when people say that they don't understand is that there are some processes, there are ways that you can engage a lot of people in participative decision making, and yet not slow down the process all that much. And so I guess what I'm looking for here is sort of that win-win. The Rainey talks about how participation really is valuable within an organization because it improves understanding among everyone. When people understand and when they're part of the decision-making process, they're more committed to whatever changes, whatever actions are required of that plan. Higher level of motivation that we've been talking about, sort of that intrinsic motivation that, hey, I know what's going on here. I'm part of the solution. So one of the things I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on here at the end of this lecture is how can you be a better facilitator, leader of teams and team meetings? Because meetings really are how communication gets done, how the work of teams gets done. So this is a quote out of the Rainey chapter, a little bit of what I was just talking about. Participation is important. Sort of typical in the Rainey book is this, this is great, but here are the drawbacks. So how do we overcome this? So here's sort of how most meetings within organizations get facilitated, at least the ones that I have been part of over my career. Presentation. One person is standing up front talking. That's common. There's a managed discussion where maybe the organizational leader is asking some questions and getting some feedback from individuals within the group. There's a status report. My organization is famous for this, where we get together in the meeting and we just go around the room and each person just reports on what projects they're working on, where they're at. Open discussion is another one, which is sort of just open up to what do people have to talk about. And then the last one is sort of the most exotic that organization or the teams tend to get into, is like, let's get creative. Let's throw out ideas. How are we going to solve this problem? The one thing that I think is common with all of these methods that are typically used is that they are not a very efficient way to engage people, because typically there's one person talking at a time. And there may or may not be other people actually listening and engaging. A lot of, people may actually be spending the time, instead of listening and thinking about what one person is saying, they may actually be more deeply engaged in thinking about their own ideas and how they're going to get their ideas in. Especially, I think I've talked in the past about, being accommodating to people in your organization who are maybe introverts, a little bit quieter, who may really have good ideas, but may not fare very well in sort of these free-for-all type of team meetings. So how can you go about facilitating meetings that are more productive? Just want to share a few resources that you can, again, go check out on your own. One of them I really like is this book called Read This Before Our Next Meeting, The Modern Meeting Standard. There's a website that has some really good online resources at modernmeetingstandard.com. This really is some good resources for streamlining, making meetings much more efficient in terms of decision making. And really, the author's idea here is that, often meetings are just discussions, but what he's advocating for is preparing in advance for meetings. Everybody should be doing reading. Potentially a decision, in most cases a decision should have already been made, and the meeting is really about discussing that decision, potentially changing the decision, but it's an interesting read in terms of making your meeting time more efficient, but requiring people to come to those meetings prepared and ready to move forward with decisions. A couple more resources I really like. This Memory Jogger is a nice tool for different sorts of group processes that you can use, typically in planning, continuous improvement, and innovation projects, those types of things. Game storming, there's another nice website that you can check out. This has a lot of different sorts of interactive group activities that you can use. I tend to use this more often when we're doing more strategic planning, maybe at a retreat type of thing where you've got a little bit more time. And then the final one that I really like, that I use a lot, I may have mentioned this before, but it's this book, The Surprising Power of Liberating Structures. And again, this has a nice supporting website at liberatingstructures.com. This little menu here that's on the side, it's a nice tool to look through. Okay, what kind of a problem are we trying to solve? What sort of interaction am I looking for my team to engage in? And then from that, you can go take a look at a nice process that might help you in anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour or 2 hours, work through a very participative process that gets a lot of people engaged. Again, I don't see a lot of managers in the organizations that I have been part of who really have developed effective team facilitation skills. It's a really hard thing to do. It takes a lot of practice, and the only way to get better at it is to actually do it and try things, and I know that's uncomfortable. But think about that in terms of your own leadership development. Find ways that you can step in front of a group, take over leadership of that, and do it in a way where you are engaging effectively everyone's ideas. I think the more ideas you get involved in decision making, the more creativity you have. That's the real strength of teams if they're used effectively. So that's it for this week. We will engage again next week. Without the rainy readings, there is one reading that I have on self-management, a sort of thinking out into the future of where organizations might be headed. Instead of a lecture next week, I'm going to post an interview that I did with a guy by the name of Michael D'Angelo, who's involved in an organization called Holacracy One that's helping a lot of big organizations across the globe implement self-management techniques. So I think it'll be really interesting. Again, it's sort of a forward-looking thing. Good luck on your projects, and we will be in touch later in the week. Thank you.